Can I start, Martina? Yeah. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Wiener Holocaust Library, both in person and online. I'm Barbara Warnock, the Senior Curator and Head of Education at the Wiener Library, and I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for this event, Rebuilding Lives, Displaced Persons in the Post-War Period. And I think it's a really important topic that isn't always considered all that much. What happened to displaced people and survivors of the Holocaust after liberation. So this event tonight is part of a couple of things. It's part of our Excavation, Confrontation, Repair, Family Histories of the Holocaust event series, and you can find out more about that online. We've also staged this event as part of B'nai B'rif's UK Jewish Heritage Festival, taking place 1st September to 31st of December. And in connection with that festival, we at the moment at the Wiener Library have a small reading room exhibition on this subject of displaced persons. And so please do visit the Wiener Library to see more in exhibition form about this important topic. So tonight we're going to be hearing from my colleague Elise Bath, who is our International Tracing Service Archive team manager, and she'll be exploring some of these different themes using documents mainly drawn from the library, and I'll leave her to tell you more. Just very quickly for the in-person audience, we don't have any fire drills or anything scheduled, so if the fire alarm sounds, then please leave towards the front of the building. The toilets are in the basement, but I think most of you are aware of that. For the online audience, if you have any questions, you're all muted, so please could you place them in the chat and we'll be able to get to you later on. So I'm now going to hand over to Elise for her talk. Thanks, Elise.
Thanks very much for that, Barbara. For those of you joining online, do let me know if you can't hear me and I will endeavour to speak up or speak more closely to the microphone. So yes, as Barbara has said, the theme of this year's Jewish Heritage Festival is renewal. So when we were asked to participate, we reflected on how our holdings and subject matter could best address that topic. At the moment, the ITS team, which I manage, is carrying out a 3-year project to raise awareness of the holdings of the Wiener Holocaust Library, in particular our digital copy of the International Tracing Service Archive, which I'll refer to as ITS from now on, and how it can be used to help people carry out research into their family members who were caught up in the Holocaust. We help survivors and their descendants based all over the UK and indeed globally, and we often find evidence of what happened to these people not only during their persecution under the Nazi regime, but also in the weeks, months and years after their persecution, when many were living in what was now known as displaced persons camps. So we thought that with this, the theme of renewal, that this period of time post-liberation, when survivors and displaced persons were facing up to the realities of a post-Nazi world, that this would be a suitable topic for the theme of renewal. So my talk this evening will give a brief overview of the DP camps, the people who lived in them and what life was like in them. And I also want to talk a little bit more about the ITS archive, the kind of documents from the post-war era it contains, and how they can be used to find evidence of where survivors were living after liberation, where they emigrated to, that sort of detail. One thing I think to bear in mind during this talk is that I think it's very important to resist the temptation to consider liberation and the months and years afterwards in triumphalist tones. Yes, there was renewal, but we do need to consider this within its context: the near destruction of European Jewry, the destruction of communities, of families, of individuals. I actually think it would almost be sort of grotesque to discuss renewal without bearing that context in mind in this talk. One of the books I read in preparation for this evening's event is Dan Stone's The Liberation of the Camps, The End of the Holocaust and Its Aftermath. And Dan actually summarizes this duality by saying, and I quote, "Sorrow and joy did not just coexist, they reinforced each other. A joyful event would always be shadowed by the recent past. Anything else would have been unimaginable," end quote. And I will include a slide at the end with recommendations for further reading in case anyone is interested in a more in-depth discussion of this topic than I can give in half an hour. So I'm going to begin with a very brief overview of the situation that thousands of survivors, refugees, and displaced persons faced at the end of war in Europe. I think when we talk about the end of the war, there's often a misconception of Allied troops approaching concentration camps and then a moment of liberation, a joyful end to incarceration, which is vastly oversimplified. Even the imagined scene of concentration camps as the site of liberation isn't very accurate. You know, thousands and thousands of people were on death marches and forced marches at war's end, many not even realizing their moment of freedom, but waking up and realizing their SS guards had fled in the night. And what of the survivors themselves? While there certainly were those individuals who experienced liberation joyfully, it doesn't take a great deal of research to come across large numbers of testimonies of survivors, which immediately complicate this notion. So this is from Birkbeck's website, and the link is included, and I'm happy to circulate this PowerPoint afterwards. So this is testimony from one Edith P., who was liberated from Salzwedel. She describes the day of her liberation, and I quote, "And I recall the same afternoon I sat on a big stone and I said to myself, what's now? What's going to happen to us now? We're all free. Are we really free? Where's the family? I'm a young person. I had had a sheltered, innocent life. What am I going to do now? Who's going to take care of me?" End quote. Liberation also didn't mean an end to suffering and death. The physical state of those liberated from the camps and death marches, for example, the effects of long-term malnourishment, starvation, mistreatment, and overwork did not disappear overnight. In Bergen-Belsen alone, in the post-war, post-liberation weeks and months, more than 13,000 people died after the camp's liberation. Within a few weeks of the liberations at the various sites around Europe where those took place, non-Jewish survivors were often free to return to their homes, and most did so, as did large numbers of Jews who had been living in Western Europe. Although this in itself was not easy. So when Primo Levi was liberated from Auschwitz, the journey from Auschwitz to his home in Turin, which was less than 800 miles as the crow flies, took almost 9 months. Those who were unable to return home, those who remained, tend to can think of them in two main categories. You've got Eastern Europeans who didn't want to return to the countries taken over by communists, Soviet citizens refusing to return to the USSR. And then you have Jews who were deemed non-repatriable because they feared anti-Semitic attacks if they were to go back to their countries of origin. For these people began what Dan Stone describes as a protracted limbo in DP camps. Just to give an idea of some context here, another one of the books I've been reading is by a woman called Jenny Edkins, Missing Persons in Politics, which I would very much recommend. The chaos, and she talks about the chaos of Europe at this point. It extended well beyond camp survivors. Edkins estimates in the aftermath of the Second World War, nearly 40 million people, most of them civilians, were displaced in Europe, needing home or refuge. As well as survivors from the concentration camp system and the forced labor system, you have people unwillingly brought from the east, people unwilling to be repatriated to the Russian zones, prisoners of war, displaced refugees, including ethnic Germans expelled from areas of Eastern Europe. So I think there were something like 12 million ethnic Germans who were also refugees. And into this mix, we also have the destruction of infrastructure, separation of families, uprooted communities, and the seeds of the Cold War being sown into the divided administrative zones of occupied Germany. As Edkins writes, it was a state of chaos that exceeded the predictions of those planning post-war relief, and the mechanisms in place to help those displaced from their homes and separated from their families were nowhere near adequate, end quote. At most, DPs were offered food and shelter, DPs being displaced persons, sorry, forgive me, and at worst, they were facing forcible repatriation to face persecution and death in their former homelands. So for those in Nazi concentration camps, liberation did not bring an end to their suffering or ensure their survival. For many, it meant long periods in other camps where their basic needs may have been met, but where they continued to be treated as objects of bureaucracy and administration, as Edkins says, not subjects with a political say in their own future. I think it's also worth mentioning briefly at this point, the real problems with statistics and numbers and trying to be accurate about what's going on here. All figures related to Holocaust survivors are approximate, and historians will never know for sure how many people were liberated 1944 to 45, how many died in the subsequent days and weeks following liberation, and how many were subsequently joined in DP camps by Eastern European refugees. So, and we need to be careful about who we're talking about here. So I think from everything that I've said to now was just sort of trying to give a context of just how chaotic the situation was at war's end. But from this point on, I'm going to be speaking more about Jewish DPs who were living in DP camps. So who was in charge of caring for the DPs? Who was actually running these DP camps and looking after them? So after VE Day in May 1945, caring for the DPs was the responsibility of SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, and later of the Allied military governments who actually deployed soldiers to guard the DP camps. DPs began to be sent back to their countries of origin, and according to information from the Arleston archives, up to 80,000 DPs were repatriated every day from the Western occupation zones in May and June 1945. So by 31st of July 1945, over 4 million displaced persons had returned home in what Stone calls a near miracle of logistics. In the camps themselves, you had various organisations that were responsible for caring for the DPs, the United National Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, from now on, along with numerous aid organisations such as the Jewish Relief Unit, with a central organisation that negotiated with various military authorities to organise care of the DPs. So from about 1946, you've got 5,000 women and 6,000 men who made up the UNRWA teams who were caring for displaced persons in Germany, Austria and Italy. The majority of these workers were young and they came from English-speaking countries, and together with various aid organisations and with the DPs themselves, and I am going to come back to talk about how much effort the DPs themselves put into this. They worked to register the displaced persons, they provided food and care locally, they arranged for people to return to their country of origin, and also tried to create various social, cultural, religious and educational programs. So a great deal of the impetus for these groups came from the DPs themselves. I'm just sort of keeping an eye on time because I'm realizing this is getting a bit detailed into a few acronyms here, I'm afraid. UNRWA ended its work in June 47, at which point you've still got more than 700,000 displaced persons still in need of care. And these people became the responsibility of the International Refugee Organization, the IRO, until the IRO ceased its work in January 1952. Now, this group of 700,000 or so DPs who were sort of stuck in this limbo in the DP camp system, they became known as the hardcore group of DPs, for whom repatriation or emigration proved difficult or impossible to arrange, whether this was due to age or infirmity. Also, numerous other aid organisations active in the camps along UNRWA and the IRO who cared for specific groups of DPs. So you've got the American Joint Distribution, which looked after Jewish DPs in particular, for example. Other organisations cared for other national groups. In terms of where DPs were housed, it really varied. So some were living in former Nazi camps, so that's Landsberg was an example of that. Others were living in barracks, in hospitals, former labour camps. There were some displaced person settlements were very small, only a few apartment blocks, and some DPs lived in external communities outside camps supported by relief agencies. So just to give you an idea of the longevity of the DP camp system, I'm going to give you a brief case study. The longest running displaced persons camp was Föhrenwald, which was a large DP camp. Oh, sorry, it's not very clear, but anyway, it's southwest of Munich. It was converted from slave labourers' accommodation and opened in June 1945. It became a Jewish-only DP camp in 3rd of October 45, and it actually was open until the 28th of February 1957. So I think when people have this idea that there was sort of the end of the war, maybe a couple of months of having to sort of deal with some of the survivors, like absolutely not. This was a system that was running until the late 50s. So with that sort of context in mind, we're now going to reflect briefly on some of the challenges that were faced by DPs. Most of the pictures I'm using in this talk come from our own collections, and I have highlighted where they're from other sources. So I think I briefly mentioned some of the privations and sufferings in the immediate aftermath of liberations, but these conditions certainly didn't dissipate overnight. They continued to be basic at best. And I think the images at the top do give a bit of a sense of just how rudimentary and how basic some of these conditions were. There was a DP camp at Warendorf, for example, where DPs were put in what had been a stud farm. And this is a quote, "In several of the stalls were whole families, women, children, and males. The cooking was outside on dixies and camp kettles. The actuality of conditions fell sadly short of the hopes and excitement of liberation." And according to Edkins, she even goes so far as to write, "Refugees were," and I quote, "frequently worse off than they had been under the Nazis." So I think you need to think as well about the psychological impact of being still held in a camp with massive restrictions on being allowed to travel, even being allowed to send letters was not allowed for quite some time in the immediate post-war period. And this had a significant impact on displaced persons' mental states. Testimonies mentioned terror at receiving medical treatments, and especially of being transported on trains to new unknown locations, just being told you're being transported somewhere else. I don't think it takes a great deal of imagination to figure out why that would be so traumatic for some of these people. Equally, not knowing how long a person was going to be held in a DP camp before being moved on or being granted an emigration visa led to this limbo-like existence where it's impossible to feel a sense of power over one's own fate and life. Many survivors wished to emigrate. They didn't want to contribute to the German economy. They didn't want to stay in Europe. They'd lost everyone. So they're wanting to emigrate, the majority wanting either to go to Palestine or the US. But it wasn't until May 48 that Israel was declared an independent state and mass immigration was permitted. So again, that's a number of years that we're talking about people being stuck in this limbo. The US also continued to operate a restrictive immigration policy in the post-war years. So between 45 and 48, survivors' options are very limited. And I did mention the hardcore group of displaced persons, difficult or impossible to repatriate or to arrange emigration to a new country. And you can't read it, I'm afraid, but this section here is documents about a young man. Okay. Oh, right. Glamorous world of hybrid events. So this document on the left-hand side refers to one of these hardcore people who were left stuck in this limbo. He was a man called Stefan, born in 1923. He lost his right eye in an explosion in the camp, and he lost a finger on his left hand, which is described in this paper as, quote, crippled. Stefan had registered several times for emigration, and even though there is a note saying you can just about read, well, you definitely can't read it when the draft makes it swing, he can do all work, but despite this, he's still not been admitted, despite having applied for emigration visas several times. Another difficulty is relationships with the authorities were often mutually suspicious. As Stone writes, and I quote, "Jews presented special difficulties for the liberators. They were more deeply traumatized. They often had nowhere to return to, no remaining family, and no hope. They were regarded suspiciously by the liberators, who often did not understand what they had been through and who considered them primitive, unhygienic, and demanding." Added onto these physical privations, restrictions on behavior and freedom, continued incarceration, basically, often the impatience and suspicion of those people running the DP camps, there was also continued anti-Semitism. So in the initial months after liberations, Jews and non-Jews were housed together, and this actually led to several instances where Jewish refugees and displaced persons were in the same camp as people who had been persecuting them, who had been camps in other areas. As well as that, anti-Semitism, it was a real problem for Jewish DPs. There was a general suspicion from local German communities, Nazism did not disappear overnight, and also from other non-Jewish DPs. So in December 45, for example, Polish displaced persons police, they burnt a synagogue during Hanukkah. Jewish cemeteries were vandalized and desecrated. So with that sort of context in mind, I do think it is important to keep that. This is the situation that people were living in, which makes the renewal that we see all the more remarkable. I'm going to look specifically at some of the efforts carried out by DPs themselves. So as well as working with some of the groups and institutions I mentioned earlier, like the IRO and UNRWA, the DPs established their own networks, their own committees, their own spokespersons, and they shaped their own cultural life. They published newspapers, opening schools and training centres. Political and religious life thrived. People were creating new literature, publishing newspapers. There was music, there was theatre, there was sports teams. So I've just sort of pulled out some of our images from our JRU collection. So you've got the first Zionist committee at the Bergen-Belsen DP camp, Passover dinner being celebrated, Hanukkah being celebrated. Holocaust survivor Paul Trepman, who was a member of the Jewish leadership in the DP camp at Bergen-Belsen, wrote, and I quote, "Teachers established good schools from nothing. People produced quality newspapers that were worth reading, even without a press. Actors established a theatre. All of this was in addition to meeting the daily needs of the new Jewish community in the camp." And here we've got, I really like this picture. I think the football team's great, but we've also got, this is an example of one of the newspapers. I think that was from Landsberg. Thanks. Oh yes, it does actually. No, yes, thank you. So training and education was a key aspect of life in the DP camps. So we have the creation of kindergartens and schools to help educate child survivors, and later to educate those children born in the camps. And this was an integral aspect of the DP camp system. So Hebrew, English, maths, drawing, gym, music, all these sorts of things were taught. And Stone quotes Shia Abramovich, a relief worker in Belsa, writing, quote, "What a pleasure it is to enter a schoolroom and hear the children of 20 or so speaking English or learning geography in Hebrew," end quote. So I think what you can see in this, obviously these are, I say proper little ones, but they're real littlies. But these people here, you can't really tell because it's quite pixelated. But if they're children, so am I. I'd say they're in their early 20s and they're getting this education because their learning has been so affected and disrupted by the previous years. And it's not only children whose education was central to DP life, but also vocational training for adults, to equip them either for life in Palestine or to make them more likely to be granted immigration visas to other countries. And my colleague Roxy pointed this out to me. It's interesting, you start to see this training is becoming very gendered again. So like the men are doing technical courses and the women are doing dressmaking. And it seems like there's almost an effort to re-establish the gendered norms that had been so blown apart through the previous year's persecution. And I just want to include this because I just think it's wonderful. This is, it's actually from the ITS archive, and it's a document saying that this chap he's now a mechanic. This is his, certificate saying that he's been trained up by the IRO, he's now a mechanic. And you can see all the images around the outside of various forms of training that people have undergone. It's quite nice to have a cheerful document, I think, in these, in this sort of talk. So an absolutely central part of DP life and the DP camps was the building of new family units. Now, I spend quite a lot of my time at the library, well, I spend an awful lot of my time at the library doing family history research, so I'm quite biased when it's my area of interest and that sort of thing, but it really does seem to me that family, the rebuilding of these units, the sort of a desperate urge to connect again, does seem vitally important to the DPs. So people who had lost everything and everyone were driven to try and recreate a normal life, to build family bonds once more. So on the left up here, we've got, it's a wedding certificate and the birth certificate. And these post-war marriages, you know, they weren't always based on love necessarily. There was a fear of loneliness, and the need for companionship did motivate many of the marriages. In his book, The World Must Know, Michael Berenbaum quotes one DP who lost his family and proposed to another DP with these words: "I am alone, I have no one, I have lost everything. You are alone, you have no one, you have lost everything. Let us be alone together." Whatever the motivation for marrying may have been, whether it was loneliness and the need for companionship, whether it was love, or given cases I've seen where a birth certificate follows 4 or 5 months after a wedding certificate, unexpected pregnancy, you know, huge numbers of marriages took place. Hadjit Lavsky writes in New Beginnings, Holocaust Survivors in Bergen-Belsen and the British Zone in Germany, that much attention was paid to weddings in the camps. Very often they were the main agenda of the social life of the camp. Numerous weddings took place in the first year after liberations, not uncommonly 6 or more in a day. So here on the left, this is from Yad Vashem, this image, but I think it's like 9 weddings that happened in one day in Athens. Yeah, that's not uncommon. During 1946, there were 1,070 weddings, and 7 couples got married on the 19th of May, 1945, alone in Bergen-Belsen DP camp. One of the clearest and most obvious indicators of renewal: children. It's interesting because it's not interesting, forgive me, but after years of starvation and mistreatment, amenorrhea, so the cessation of menstruation, was prevalent among a lot of the female survivors and displaced persons. So the beginning of, or the return of menstruation, was both a literal and a symbolic indication of renewal and future potential. Stone quotes Zippy Orlin, a DP worker in the Belsen Children's Home, saying, and I quote, "One morning there was great excitement in the ward when Hannah started her first period. It was celebrated like a miracle, as no one had menstruated since entering the camp." And this, end quote, and this return of fertility led to quite an astounding birth rate. DP camps, the birth rate in the DP camps was amongst the highest in the world at that time. In Bergen-Belsen DP camp alone, 555 babies were born in 1946. And here are just some images from the ones on this side are images from our collections. And I am going to briefly speak about the JRU photographs at the end. As well as the urge to rebuild family units, there was also a desperate urge to trace family. This is mentioned time and time again by survivors, by the JRU staff, by historians. You know, Mark Ryman has said that for DPs, and I quote, "questions of food, clothing, and even health were secondary to locating loved ones," end quote. This woman on the left, Senta Hertz, was a German Jewish refugee who returned as a JRU worker. She was in Bergen-Belsen in 1945 and described survivors' needs thus, I quote, "There was one outstanding wish apart from the clothing. Do help us to find our relatives. I heard from my brother or uncle or so-and-so who lives at Camp Munich. Help me to go there," end quote. This task of trying to find loved ones faced almost insurmountable practical difficulties. Lack of freedom of travel, which we've already mentioned. There's a lack of solid infrastructure, lack of funds, lack of petrol, lack of paper. DPs weren't allowed to send mail. All the post had to be sent via the welfare staff. So for example, via JRU workers. That's in the initial earliest days and weeks, possibly months after liberation. So what happened was the smallest pieces of biographical information were shared by word of mouth in the early days before the creation of a central tracing agency. Francesca Wilson was an UNRWA worker. She wrote about this network, this sort of whisper network almost. It's quite a long quote, but I think it's worth reading. "Newcomers to any camp were questioned by those already there, and names and details were published in camp newspapers or posted on notice boards. People listened to radio broadcasts giving the names of DPs trying to contact relatives. In relation to the daily half-hour loudspeaker announcements, she describes, all activity stops. People stand still, listening and hoping. Every now and then a voice screams, 'Me, that's me,' and somebody who has ceased to be a lost soul rushes wildly towards the administration building. At other times, a couple of men will look at each other, then one will go to the office to report how so-and-so, mentioned over the loudspeaker, was killed at Dachau," end quote. And there were some reunions. Francesca Wilson again, she drove a young Polish refugee who had heard some rumors of his sister and a cousin working in another camp. The search seemed fruitless, but, and I quote, "suddenly a door opened and there they were, and in a trice, brother and sister were in each other's arms," end quote. With a degree of understatement, she recalls there was something of a scene, but she also describes it as miraculous, so that it was not the norm. Particularly painful to read are the attempts by parents to find their missing children. Edkins quotes some of the descriptions circulated by desperate parents. Stella Falk, a quiet and calm child with a particularly deep voice and a doll with real hair. Sigfrid Zagotta, a solid, plump baby, born 1st of July 1943, last seen February 1945, wearing a dark blue romper suit with his full name printed on it. Norbert Wolf, a fair child, blue eyes, born 8th of June 1942, went missing on 7th of May 1945 at the Czech border. And while the search for children often calls to mind little ones, you also have parents searching for their adult children too, which is just as moving. And the searching relating to children cuts both ways. So not only parents trying to find their lost children, but these three little ones here on the right, they've been found. They're foundling children. We don't know the name. They don't know who they are. And so DP camps were sites where efforts were made to try and find families for these little ones. And I realise, as I said, I'm coming from this from a rather biased perspective of someone who focuses on family research, but it does seem to me that family really was one of the cornerstones of the DP's efforts at renewal. And these efforts to find out what happened to family members is something that is still being carried out today. You know, we have children, grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren come to us trying to find out what happened to people during the Holocaust. So I'm now going to turn to that sort of modern day searching and talk briefly about the ITS archive and what material it contains related to DPs. So just very briefly, the International Tracing Service, the ITS, contains over 30 million documents connected with the experiences of over 17.5 million people during and after the Nazi era. Here at the library, we hold the UK's digital copy of the archive, which we use for many purposes, including, and I spend a lot of time doing this, tracing individual victims of Nazi persecution, as I said, normally on behalf of their relatives. So I thought what I might do now is sort of pull up some of the displaced person related material that is in the ITS archive and talk about how it can be used to trace in family research today. So this is a camp. I've just pulled out some of the most common examples that I come across a lot. So what DP documents are stored in the archive? Well, it's the ITS's initial focus was to search for survivors of Nazi persecution. So it originally held material from liberated camps, registration documents for forced labourers, prison lists, that sort of thing. But it also, as time passed, it also became a repository for millions of documents being produced in the various DP camps, as well as, for example, duplicates of passenger lists on emigration ships and from individual DP camps. So there's about 3.5 million displaced person documents in the ITS, but none are from the Soviet occupied zone. So as vast as the ITS archive is, there are still these gaps in it, which is just sort of a historical quirk, I'm afraid. The documents are written mainly in English or French, the languages of the occupying powers, but there is material in German, Polish, Lithuanian, various other languages. And while these documents were initially used to search for survivors of Nazi persecution from the 1950s, the material also became important to German and other authorities for reviewing compensation claims, pension claims, and immigration proceedings. So I was trying to have a look at how many of our cases involve people who were DPs. So my colleague Ian and I, as I said, we traced what happened to individual victims of Nazi persecution. And I had a look at our statistics for what we've done this year so far. And actually a large minority of the people we've researched survived. So 42.9% of the people that we've researched so far this year survived the Nazi period. Now, not all those people will have gone through the DP camps, and not all those people have documentation that still exists for us to look at today. But you get a sense there of how useful these DP records can be today in tracing families. They're certainly a valid and very useful source of information for us to explore. So, slightly changed my slide too soon, forgive me. So I pulled out some of the most common documents that we have in relation to DPs. In the British and American zones, each displaced person had 2 of these cards, which is why we're calling it the DP2 card. The DP took 1 copy of the card with them as they moved between the camps, and the duplicate was sent to ITS, where we can still see it today. So you can see that there's key information is recorded here. We've got basic biographical information at the top, parents' names, which is really useful for when we're trying to rebuild a family tree, for example, languages spoken, last address. At the bottom left here, you can see 2 sisters, Ruth and Rania. So we really are starting to get a bigger sense of the family ties here, which can be very useful today when we're trying to figure out who people were. If we look on the reverse of this card, I know it doesn't look like anything really, but there is quite a lot of information here about a person's health. So there's information about immunizations received. So typhoid, she didn't get diphtheria. She's got, is that tuberculosis? Not sure, I can double check. But this section on the left-hand side where you can see the box L has been ticked, that L, M, C, D, and D, they were categories used to describe the physical state of a person. So this person at this point, when this card is filled in, L stands for labour, meaning that the person is well enough to work. So M is for movement, a person would be well enough to survive transport to another DP camp. CD, communicable disease, and D for disability. So what seems at first glance like quite a banal card, when you know how to read them, actually does contain quite a lot of information. Typhoid and paratyphoid. she's got. That's what that is. They also have, and this is another sort of key area of key document that are very useful to us, displaced persons identity cards. So from January 1948, the US military administration ordered that DPs, including newborns born in the camp, should receive identity cards. So this sort of document was immediately issued. These were valid until 1952, which is when the IRO stopped its operations. But again, you can see basic biographical information, but also if there's a photograph, that can be very impactful to families who may never have seen a photograph of this person before. There are slightly different variations. Each occupying authority did things slightly differently. So this is from the French occupation zone, biographical information on the left, the photograph as usual. But on the right, we've got the brief description in French of this lady's path of persecution. So it's a fantastic tool for research. Another document from the French occupation zone. There's also information like this, which is very difficult to read, I'm sorry. This is an emigration list. So when people went to, most of them seem to be America actually, but there are also some to other locations. So you have precise dates of when a person left, where they were going. Often you have the address here of where they were going to, so a relative in the US that they were going to live with, for example. And we also have care and maintenance applications. I'm not expecting anyone to be able to read any of that, don't worry. When the IRO took over responsibility in 1947 for the DPs, its staff conducted a review of the DPs, and to continue receiving support, they had to fill in these very detailed questionnaires about themselves and their families. So they gathered biographical information, details on educational history, work experience, where they'd been for like the last 10, 12 years. Financial situation was also outlined. So what funds did they have to emigrate? Were they earning? How much? What sort of professional skills did they have? I pulled these out because I wanted to give you a sense of, for a start, how rich these documents can be, but also some of the real difficulties in working with them. This one on the right, I know you can barely read it here, but I can barely read it on the version that I see on my screen as well. It's sort of handwritten scroll. It's just another challenge, but they are very rich documents, so it is worth it to sort of push through. So if anyone here does think that this might be useful for them, if they would like me to see if I can find any information about their relatives, or if there's anyone that you work with that you think would be useful, pass this information on. We are still doing research cases as best we can, and you can apply through our website. So I'm aware of time, so I just want to sort of wrap up now and come back to these first images that we were looking at. It's impossible to give a detailed overview of the situation for displaced persons in this sort of brief talk. I just hope I've given some sense of how long the process of liberation took, for how many years afterwards people were sort of trapped in this system, and some of the real difficulties and challenges they faced. Bearing in mind the theme of this year's festival, renewal, I hope I've also been able to show that the camps were a site of independent, determined, self-led renewal, with the creation of thriving societies pushing education, arts, sports, literature, newspapers. The emphasis that displaced persons themselves placed on the importance of families is particularly stark, both in terms of their efforts, sadly often in vain, to find their lost loved ones, but also in their determination to build new family units. But as I said at the beginning, I think it is important to place this undoubted spiral of renewal in its context. And I really don't want to forget those people for whom there was no option of renewal. So I'm going to finish by reading an account that my colleague Roxy brought to my attention. So thank you very much. It's a few sentences, but I do think it's worth reading aloud in full if you'll bear with me. And it describes a man living in the Eschwege displaced persons camp. Joseph H. is 70 years old. He has lost his wife and children in the ghetto and wants to join his only living brother, his only living relative, a brother in England. But as he is well over age, he stands no chance. We have not yet broken the sad news to him, but I fear he guesses the truth. He used to come at least once a week to ask whether we had any news concerning his emigration. Now he does not come anymore. He is a deeply religious, quiet, restrained man, and as there are very few old people in the camp, he is usually alone. Time passes slowly, very slowly for him. He gives Hebrew lessons to young children, tries to help wherever he can, and waits, like all the others. At his age, man only has a little time to lose, and it is only a spark of hope which keeps him going. But he never complains. Life has broken him, but has not deprived him of his dignity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, am I on? Oh. Right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Elise. That was really fascinating. It's wonderful. So do we have any questions from the audience here or online? I'll come to online in a moment. I think we've got a question here.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. So I was just interested in justice and the DP camps. So you said that perpetrators and victims sometimes were in the same camp, and were there any kind of effort then to ensure that the perpetrators were punished? And on the other hand, also the Jewish cause of honors, I heard that was also existed in DP camps, like the Jewish honor courts. Could you maybe, because I don't know so much about it, I was just curious to hear.
Yeah, so yeah, there are certainly cases of perpetrators literally alongside Jewish DPs. In fact, my colleague Ian was just looking at the case yesterday where a guy who had been a camp guard in a concentration camp in Croatia was sort of fleeing west and sort of putting himself forward as in need of support from the IRO or UNRWA, whoever was in charge at the time he was there. So at that stage, you know, the Allied authorities didn't see a need to separate the communities, and there were certainly instances of, especially in the very early days, immediately post-liberation, of what could be described as very rough justice, in terms of your question about justice. I have to say there'll be more information about that sort of thing in the books I'm recommending, so I've just had to give a very basic overview today, but I'm very happy to sort of look into it a bit more, and if you give me your email address, I can come to you with some more feedback about sort of the Jewish honor codes. It's interesting, I couldn't really get into it just with time, but the various sort of political groups, political Jewish movements that sort of thrived in the camps and flourished, but I sort of had to pick what I was going to talk about, and I thought family is more my area. So, but yes, it's very much just the very tip of the iceberg, I'm afraid.
Okay, any questions here?
Thanks, Elise, that was great. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more, you know, you kind of talked about the documents in ITS, and obviously lots of them were created by UNRWA, by the IRO, by relief officers. But I wondered if you could speak about how you kind of find DP voices within those documents, and how they can also put forward kind of DP's own thoughts and ideas through the other people kind of creating them.
Yeah, definitely. So if I go back to these ones, care and maintenance applications, people's voices come through very strongly here. So while they are quite formulaic and, you know, very tick your boxes, and this section's for education, this section's for professionalism, that sort of thing, at the end, often you'll find just a handwritten narrative where someone is just writing what has happened to them, why they can't go back to their country of origin, where they want to go. And sometimes it is very heartrending that you'll have these sentences of just saying that, you know, there may be a question saying, why do you not want to be repatriated to your home country? And it'll just say, because I have no one, or because they killed my family. And you do get this, you do get people's individual voices coming through, almost despite the nature of the documents. It's yeah, you have to sort of read some of the documents against the grain almost. There's also post-war letters that come through sometimes in other parts of the archive, where people, again, they're claiming compensation and they're writing these letters about what happened to them. So there is, although it is a very formal document, the documents in the ITS, the survivors and the displaced people often still take the opportunity to and manage to get their own voice in there, which is always very important.
My question kind of follows on from that, in the sense of just, I wanted to ask a bit more about language, and especially German language, because the Landsberger newspaper that you showed, I think it said Zeitung, but it wasn't spelt as you would expect. And I have heard in other accounts of people who could speak German, and maybe even German was their first language, no longer wanted to speak German and therefore spoke Yiddish. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about language and again that idea of renewal.
Absolutely, especially in, as I said, in relation to renewal, there was a real push for Hebrew lessons, and there was at some points there was a real distaste for everything German, the language of even though they'd maybe lived there and grown up there, and it was their mother tongue, it has become the language of the persecutors. And that's also a reason I think why Zionism really started to flourish, because there was a sense of, no, I'm not contributing to this country's economy. I'm not helping this country. I don't want anything to do with this anymore. And you do come across that attitude, an awful lot, which fair enough, completely understandable. So yeah, English and Hebrew were really pushed in the education things from what I've seen from the reading I've done for this.
I think we've got a question online. So Alan is asking whether Jews from Shanghai who did not get accepted into the USA due to the quota system remained in DP camps in Germany, and does the ITS have any details?
We do have some documents from people who went to Shanghai. It's normally lists of where people were living, sometimes lists of people who died while they were in Shanghai. Lots of the emigration lists. So this sort of thing. We've got a lot of those sorts of documents connected with Shanghai. And again, if people were submitting compensation claims afterwards or asking for information about what had happened to them or their loved ones, those documents would still be held in the ITS archive. So basically, if you do have relatives or someone you're interested in who was in Shanghai, it's definitely worth coming to us and we'll have a look and see what we can find.
Okay, thank you. So I think online, there's also somebody sort of asking if they can kind of share the result, get access to the resources. So perhaps if people kind of leave their email addresses, we can send this document to you.
Yes, thank you. You have reminded me of something I forgot to say. Sorry, Roxy, I forgot to say. We have just very recently received funding from Towns Web Archiving to digitise the Jewish Committee for Relief Abroad and the Jewish Relief Unit photograph collections. So most of the photographs that were in my presentation today are from the JRU. They're wonderful. They're such a fantastic resource. So hopefully over the next few years, we're going to get those digitized and available for everyone to look at. But it's a remarkable collection. It really is. So that's very exciting. And we're looking forward to that project developing.
And have you got other events planned in this event series?
Yes, we do have other events in the Family History series. So if you keep an eye on our events page, they'll be announced. And also our previous ones are available to view on YouTube.
Okay, thank you. So the recording of this event will be available on YouTube soon, along with the other events. Unless there's any final questions here, just remains for me to say thank you all so much for coming online and in person, and thank you so much for Elise for a really fascinating talk. So if you just join me in thanking Elise again. And good night to everybody.